Greetings to all of my friends and colleagues here in India. I see that this university is heavily oriented toward the hard sciences. That is a very good reason to hear from a historian like me. History is a unique liberal arts discipline because it is part literature and part science. And history has become more scientific over the past 3 decades. I have led this thrust, and I will continue to do so. Even when I was a mature scholar teaching at Rutgers, a major university in the United States, historians focused narrowly on more or less important times and places. They studied more and more about less and less. They worked alone, writing their research notes on index cards by hand. Few other scholars paid attention to their work, even within the academic world, much less in the wider world. With few exceptions, their influence in the outside world was almost absent. I adopted digital humanities technology, which fundamentally changed all that. Many of us now seek to work more and more collaboratively, more and more globally, across disciplines, and asking more and more questions important to the wider world. And we collect and use massive data, applying information technology. But first, let me tell you what a joy it is for me to participate in this exciting interdisciplinary conference at this excellent university in Assam, India. I deeply regret that I cannot participate as a live person, only visually, because regardless of high-quality technology, a live lecture is a much better form of communication. A good lecture is a performance and is closer to art than a simple communication of knowledge. I appreciate performance because I started my life as a musician and then became a historian. So here is my first experience with interdisciplinary studies. Trying and failing to master music was among the greatest challenges of my life, and it turned out to be good for me. At last I had found something that didn't come easy. It required work and discipline. The structure of music, especially Baroque music, became patterned in my brain. It is not linear. It is not univocal. It is complex, ever-changing, interactive patterns over time, and it is variations on themes. When I finally became a historian, that is the way I wrote. I had no idea that my painful efforts to learn piano and music theory, and more importantly, being immersed in the world of music, would help me become an original creative historian. It helped me transcend linear national history and embrace comparative global history. On a more practical note, learning how to use a keyboard with relaxed wrist and articulated fingers helped me become a good typist. I did all my own typing as I evolved into a historian. I still do, despite my age and severe osteoarthritis in every joint, including my hands. So please believe me, I would do everything in my power to attend this conference and get to know as much about each of you and your work as possible. But I live with my son and his Mexican family in Mexico, and he forbids me to travel by air more than 3 hours at a time. He is an internationally renowned emergency physician, so I can't argue with him. I will be 90 years old in June and have some important work to do before I die, so please accept my apology for not being there in person. I have always been an internationalist as well as an interdisciplinary scholar. I learned some of my major questions from Mexican and Brazilian colleagues. Scholars from the USA and Brazil learned from each other for more than a century. Gilberto Freire learned from and was inspired by Franz Boas, a German Jew who taught at Columbia University in New York during the 1920s. Boas was the founder of cultural anthropology and the greatest voice for racial equality at a time when so-called scientific racism prevailed everywhere. Before he studied with Boas, Freire believed that all the problems of Latin America, including Brazil, stemmed from its darker and mixed blood population, and the only solution was to bring in large numbers of white immigrants and encourage its dark-skinned population to die out and or be absorbed by a large immigration of racially superior whites. Freire abandoned this consensus of Latin American thought and embraced and popularized the concept that Brazil's greatest strength was the biological and cultural mixture of her population. This was a great positive step at the time he published during the 1930s, although Freire falsely claimed that African slavery and racism was mild in Brazil, and that Portuguese colonization was positive throughout the world by glamorizing the Portugal male's supposedly unique tendency to create a mixed-race population. But Freire's embrace of race mixture in Latin America was an enormous step forward, an interpretation first made by the Mexican philosopher and Minister of Education José Vasconcelos in his book La Raza Cósmica, first published in 1925. Caribbean scholars have refined these ideas to the concept of creolization as a basis for culture formation, as well as of languages in the Caribbean. I brought the concept of creolization to my studies of the formation of colonial Louisiana culture. It has been widely adapted to cultures throughout regions of the United States. What Africans in colonial Louisiana, the development of Afro-Creole culture in the 18th century, which was my book, did is best explained by one of the 9 book prizes it won, the John Hope Franklin Prize, awarded by the American Studies Association in 1993. I quote, "In making its selection of Africans in colonial Louisiana, the committee cited the book's wide range of original research and its certain impact on many fields of American culture. Providing a solid ground for theory and extensive and difficult archival documentation, the book combines work in African American history, diaspora and Caribbean culture, anthropology, linguistics, and colonial American history. It opens to view a new transnational conception of American culture that grew from slavery and from slave resistance, and describes a process of creolization whose full effects have perhaps only become apparent, at least to scholars in the present day. More than any of the more than 100 books submitted to the committee by publishers throughout the country, Africans in Colonial Louisiana, promises to shape the course of future research in American studies for many years to come. End quote. Africans in Colonial Louisiana did exactly that. Did it matter? Yes, indeed. It redefined what American culture is, making us identify as one people. Well, not all of us, but white nationalists are a dying breed. They still believe that the United States, or should be white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, and that immigrants and the so-called lesser races should adopt their language and culture right away. But the process of creolization blends the greatest strengths of all our peoples and cultures, including Native Americans, Africans, Europeans, Asians, Mexicans, and Caribbeans. So let me talk a little about my other book, which was just published in Portuguese in Brazil in 2017. In 1984, I began to produce the first original digital database in historical studies, first published on a compact disc in 2000 by Louisiana State University Press. I started my database after I discovered documents in the Point Coupé Parish Courthouse containing rich information about slaves, and more surprising, they're largely self-identified African ethnicities. At that time, historians and other researchers put research notes on index cards. But I found so much detail in these descriptions of slaves, I quickly found that I needed a more complex tool for collecting and understanding it. I began to construct this database after I discovered the quantity, richness, and complexity of the information in documents describing thousands of slaves. And at that time, people thought there was no way of knowing anything at all about slaves. Personal computers were just coming on the market then and were expensive, big, and heavy, and not exactly easy to use. They did not have enough memory for an operating system or software, which had to be inserted on a thick disk and another disk inserted to add memory. Unlike other databases, mine was original digital because the data was entered almost entirely directly from manuscript documents, and it was massive data. It contains a greater variety of African ethnicity designations than any other documents in the Americas. There is extensive data about names, gender, age, racial designations, family relationships, prices, skills, illnesses, character as perceived by their masters, and testimony by slaves about running away and their involvement in conspiracy and revolts against slavery. I included all information found about each slave, including what type of document we found them in and how to find the original document. My team and I databased all documents about slaves through 1820 in archives and courthouses throughout Louisiana, plus information about slave trade voyages coming directly from Africa, from archives in France and Spain. The slave database contains over 100,000 descriptions of slaves from documents. The free records contain even more information about 4,000 slaves who were freed or in process of being freed, including how and why they were freed, by whom, how the slave was related to the freer, the price paid when there was a self-purchase or a purchase by another person to free them, terms and conditions of freedom, and the name, racial designation, and origin of the mother of the freed. In all, there are over 104,000 slave descriptions. One advantage of databases is they can be asked specific questions, and by using statistical package software, calculations, and graphs, they can be answered quickly and easily. These are questions which no one thought to ask before because they assumed they could not be answered. The results of calculations made on these databases often refute speculative conclusions and the collective so-called wisdom passed on by historians who base themselves on less reliable, more subjective sources, including views and opinions of travelers and officials who lived way back then. But best of all, they give rich information about the slaves who nobody thought we could know anything about. Although I created these databases mainly for my own research and writing, I figured they would be used by other scholars and knew they could be helpful to genealogists who could trace their ancestry back to colonial and early American times. Thanks to a National Endowment for the Humanities Collective Research contract awarded to me and Patrick Manning, I spent most of the 1990s completing the databases for all of Louisiana through 1820 and preparing them for publication on CD with the help of a few research assistants I trained. My colleague Paul Lachance gave me generous, highly skilled help as usual. He, Ginger, and Jeffrey Gould contributed their databases to the CD. I didn't expect my databases to make waves, but a few weeks after my 71st birthday, David Firestone, then one of the two Southern regional reporters for the New York Times, came to my house at 1300 Dante Street in New Orleans to interview me. Firestone was experienced working with databases, and he quickly realized their value and potential. He, too, had started using databases on personal computers during the mid-1980s and was teaching other New York Times reporters how to create and use them. He was surprised little attention had been paid to mine and asked me if I was surprised or disappointed. I said no, because although it might sound immodest, I am usually at least 20 years ahead of my times, and perhaps if I lived to be 90, I would see my work appreciated. As Firestone walked out the door, he said, "We'll see about that." His extensively illustrated article began on the front page of the New York Times on Sunday, July 30th, 2000, and continued on most of two inside pages of the national sector. An Associated Press story appeared all over the country in large newspapers and small. It contained a photo of me and my dog in my tropical patio in New Orleans. ABC World News, Lifetime Live, and Cable News Network broadcast television stories and interviews. NPR and BBC World News did several radio broadcasts. People magazine published a story about me, my family, and the databases. The Journal of the American Bar Association, November 2000, published an article featuring Percy Pierre, a great electrical engineer, on its cover. He had found the ethnicity of his African ancestor on my database before it was published, and he was quoting as saying he wanted reparations. There was a large inside story about the implications of the databases for African American reparations. It concluded that my database is a major refutation of legal arguments against reparations, because now we can identify the specific victims and perpetrators of the enslavement of particular Africans and their descendants and assess concrete damages based on the prices paid for them. I suddenly became so-called famous for a little while because my database revealed substantial details about just about every slave who lived in Louisiana between 1719 and 1820. But the most frequent question asked me was, "Are you really 71 years old? Wasn't your age a misprint?" Few could believe a 71-year-old woman created a cutting-edge tool in digital humanities. But I had just gotten started. I never believed the consensus that Africans lost all their cultural heritage during the transatlantic crossing or shortly thereafter, a hotly debated topic for years. I wanted to know who they were, where they were clustered, and why. I completed and published the English version of my book, Slavery and African Ethnicities in the Americas, Restoring the Links, in 2005. First, let me say a few words about it. It is probably the first truly Afro-Atlantic book because it attempts to include all the major times and places of the transatlantic slave trade in Africa, and it is even fairly short. The hardest part was conceiving it and figuring out some of the right questions to ask. I can't claim I came up with the right answers. It is only an attempt to do so. That will hopefully be the task of my younger colleagues, which includes just about everyone because I am so old. I made several proposals to find ways to work collaboratively with the many scholars who were by then creating their own slave databases and find ways to link at least part of them together online. During the last half of the decade of 2000, I wrote several unsuccessful proposals, which were rejected mainly because I did not have an affiliation with the university capable of doing this. I solved this problem too. In February 2010, I was invited by Walter Hawthorne to speak at Michigan State University. While I was there, I met with Hawthorne and Dean Rayberger, director of Matrix, MSU's Institute for Digital Humanities, where I detailed my plans and proposals to create a universal slave database. I returned to East Lansing on June 1st, 2010, and moved into an apartment I shared with my dearest, oldest friend, Mabel Robinson Williams, widow of Robert Francis Williams, leader of the armed self-defense movement against the Ku Klux Klan in Monroe, North Carolina. He inspired many other similar movements, especially in the Deep South. So at Michigan State University, I wrote a grant proposal when I was 81 years old, with help from Walter Hawthorne, Dean Rayberger, and Christine Root, to store and link the many databases about individual slaves which sprouted up after mine. It was enthusiastically approved by the National Endowment for the Humanities, but their funding was slashed that year. But we did do some important, innovative collective work. We started a collaborative, universal best practices slave database by reaching out to fellow scholars throughout the world with Skype, while holding weekly meetings for an entire year with Paul Lachance, Catherine Foley, and me. Catherine wrote an impressive summary of our work in our final report to the National Endowment for the Humanities. We organized an influential conference at MSU in 2013, which brought together some impressive slave database projects opening up future collaborations among their creators. But the project remained at an elementary stage of programming when I left MSU in late 2014. It was stalled because of lack of funding. Then the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation approached Matrix to help them and some partner projects apply for substantial funding to resume our collaborative database project. Mellon came up with almost $1.5 million in January 2018 for 18 months, for starters, for MSU and some prestigious partners to prove they could create a hub linking individual enslaved people on each other's platforms, with promise of even more funding beyond the initial proof of concept period. I am now optimistic that this ambitious project will succeed. As we continue to develop a best practices slave database to link similar projects throughout the world, millions of Africans and their descendants whose very existence has been denied and or ignored will join other slaves in cyberspace. I hope that my Indian colleagues will join us in research and database information about the many free and enslaved Africans who were a vital part of the varied population of India. I used to believe I was a tiny, insignificant clog in the huge wheel of history, moving ever forward towards inevitable progress. Now I know better. Progress is made by people who make ethical choices and inspire others to do so as well. That is the powerful role of the individual in history. It's the people who do what is right because it is the right thing to do and for no other reason who finally win, even though it often takes a long, long time. They rarely get the credit, but that's not why they do it. So let's work together across racial, national, and religious lines to save our fragile world by making it a better one. Thank you all very much, and I will be pleased to answer any questions that you might have.